Today I'm going to be going through all the bosses from Dark Souls 3 and deciding whether I think they're overrated, underrated, or properly rated. And since I'm a huge DS3 enjoyer, I'm pretty excited for this one. Best bosses in the series, by the way. And don't worry, I'll do Bloodborne next. First up, we got Iudex Gundyr, one of the best tutorial bosses in the series. Iudex does a great job teaching the player to, well, get good. This was my introduction to the series, and I'm grateful to have had a boss that gave me a good challenge without scaring me away. His second phase was so shocking too, and I think it was a perfect way to kick off this game. Obviously, he's no trouble at all once you actually learn how to play the game, but I'm still gonna say he's underrated due to his overall quality and rank amongst the other tutorial bosses. Next up, we have Vordt. I think he was a pretty good choice for the second boss in the game and forces the player to learn to adapt. I don't think the frost mechanic was the best idea this early on in the game because I genuinely had no idea what it even did to me until like my fourth playthrough. Vordt is a perfect challenge for this point in the game, and it'll make sure your reaction time is on point. He'll actually bully you into it, but it still works. He's nothing more than another enemy in your way in subsequent playthroughs, but since most people seem to think he's fairly solid, I'll go with properly rated here. Moving on, let's go to the curse-rotted Greatwood. After you're done throwing up in your mouth a few times, you might be able to pull yourself together and actually fight this boss. Well, not really fight, more like roll around and hit his big old grapes. The thing I really dislike about this boss is the other enemies around. I know the Greatwood ends up killing most of them, but they're just a bit of a nuisance in the first phase and felt kind of unnecessary. I don't really have anything Greatwood to say about this boss, at least he's optional, I guess. Not fun, but I think most everyone agrees with that. Properly rated. Next up, we have the Crystal Sage. This one's interesting to me because I kind of hate it, but I also think it gets more hate than it deserves. Maybe it's just because people hate it for the wrong reasons. Most people say it's too easy. I honestly do not have an easy time with this boss. I don't know if I'm just terrible or what, but when the clones spawn in the second phase, I get so overwhelmed with all the magic spam that I feel like I can't do anything. Even if I find the real Crystal Sage among the clones in time, you're still getting shot in the back non-stop before you can even swing your weapon. Sure, you can run around and take all the clones out first, but I'm greedy. I still think this boss is a cool idea in theory, but it just missed the mark. Properly rated. And before we go to the Abyss Watchers, I'm giving away the poster I got from the Elden Ring Jazz show last September. If you want to enter, just subscribe and follow me on Instagram or Twitter, and I'll announce the winner when I hit 100k. But moving on to the Abyss Watchers, I cannot believe how many people in my comments slander this boss. It's one of the best in the game, and sure, it's easy now, but I was screaming, shaking, and crying after I beat the first phase, only to see that there was another phase following it. Even playing through it now, it's still one of the tougher early game bosses in this series, and I think it's designed perfectly. The thrill of balancing the three Watchers in the first phase while trying to take down the main one is amazing, and trying to get parries and backstabs is so much fun. They balance the gank perfectly by adding one neutral Watcher to take some of the heat off you, which I think is the best possible solution for this. In addition, the second phase is incredibly cinematic and blew my mind the first time I saw it. Good challenge for the early game and a ton of fun. Underrated. Next up, we have the Deacons of the Deep, a boss that seems to be the butt of the joke in Dark Souls 3. The Deacons are a cool idea, but obviously get made fun of for their lack of difficulty. While I agree this is probably the easiest boss in the game, it's still pretty satisfying to run through a bunch of basic enemies who barely hit you back. It didn't necessarily feel lazy, but I think if they added some big dramatic second phase after the first health bar, it would have felt a little bit more fleshed out. Your only real threats here are getting surrounded and getting cursed, both of which are pretty easy to avoid if you can control your impulses, unlike me, so this boss is more of a glorified enemy mob than anything else. Properly rated. Moving on to High Lord Wolnir, you know, when I first fought this boss, I didn't really think much of it. I just hit the bracelets and was done, easy peasy. But then I started doing new playthroughs where I was a little more underleveled when fighting him, and oh my, this became a nightmare. A lot of it feels like RNG, but he decides to move his left hand out of the way whenever he feels like it, making it basically a dodging simulator while you wait for him to rest. He also has some buddies that spawn in that make the fight much more unpleasant. I never thought I'd say this, but give up, skeleton. Please give up. Also, I made shirts that say that. You should get one. But really, let's be real. The mist is the actual culprit of this fight and ruins most of the fun for me, so I'm gonna go overrated. Next up, we have the Old Demon King. This one gets forgotten about a lot, and I think it's a shame because it's really not bad. Sure, it's essentially a reskin of the 3 demon bosses from Dark Souls 1, but this one is miles ahead of any of those. I don't think this is one of the best bosses in the game, but it's still pretty enjoyable despite being a bit too easy, so I'll say it's slightly underrated due to how much it's overlooked. It's fitting to the area as well as a nice little callback to the first game, and I still think the fight is pretty fun. Moving on to Pontiff, for a while I thought this was one of the most slept on bosses in the series, but it feels like more people have been appreciating him. This is one of the most unique humanoid enemies we've seen with an incredible challenge to back it up. By far the most tries I've ever spent on a boss, and even with all my deaths, it still always felt fair. Obviously, Obviously, the challenge is diminished greatly once you learn to parry him, but I still think he's one of the hardest in the main game. His combos go for what feel like centuries, and his second phase with the Shadow Clone makes the fight feel super overwhelming and intense. I'm still gonna say Pontiff is underrated because he's one of the fights I look forward to most when playing this game, and it never disappoints. Next up, speaking of disappointing, we have Yhorm. This guy disappointed me a lot. I was really expecting a cool giant fight, and unfortunately, that's not quite what I received. To be fair, I don't really think smacking his ankles would have been all that fun either, so I don't really know what would have been better. But the Storm Roller mechanic was cool. Despite not being what I wanted, I still think the fight is cool for what it is. This is a gimmick fight that I think could have been done a lot better, but I will admit it's pretty satisfying even on subsequent playthroughs. I think it was just disappointing for what a staple he was in the game overall, and when I finally got to the fight, I was a little bit underwhelmed. Overrated. Moving on to Aldrich, this was an interesting fight to me that I'm still not sure how to feel about it, despite playing through this game dozens of times. On one hand, this boss has a ton of different attacks. It's really exciting as a whole, but I found a lot of things about this fight to be pretty annoying. First of all, any boss that runs away from you at random points for no reason always upsets me, besides maybe the Twin Princes, because it feels like a cop-out from giving them real counters. I just think of fights like the Elden Beast where they know they can't do anything to get you to stop attacking, so they just have it swim away. And second of all, the arrow attack, man, this thing has killed me so many times I don't even want to think about it. It's so broken, if this attack even touches you, you're pretty much done for. Other than that attack specifically, I think the fight is pretty easy overall, and while it is cool objectively, I'm personally not a huge fan. Overrated. Next up, oh boy, we have the Dancer. The Dancer's a pretty awesome boss, let's not beat around the bush here. Crazy attack patterns, cool design, incredible soundtrack, everything about the Dancer is perfect to me. She gets plenty of praise already, and honestly, my only gripe is that her difficulty was way overhyped. I'm sure people are referencing the difficulty when fighting her early, but if you face her normally, she shouldn't really be a huge problem. I think this is the perfect mid-game boss, and FromSoft did an incredible job with the balancing here. Not to mention, the way it connects back to the beginning is pretty cool. I'd say underrated, but come on, we all love the Dancer. Properly rated. Moving on, we've got Dragonslayer Armour. I know a lot of people like this one too, man, but not enough. This has got to be one of the most underrated bosses in the series and deserves its props, so I'm gonna give it to him. Dragonslayer Armour is one of the crazy epic duels that makes these games so great. It's kind of like Gundyr, but a little more hardcore with his gigantic shield and huge windups that instantly delete half of your health bar. This is a great 1v1, and I always find bosses with shields interesting to fight because it forces you to get a little creative with your attack windows. The only thing I don't love about this fight is the butterfly attack in the second phase, but it doesn't happen too often or anything, so it's not a huge deal. It just feels kind of impossible to see coming when you're already so focused on the Dragonslayer. But it still adds a layer of intensity to the fight towards the end, and the whole fight is already amazing as a whole, so definitely underrated. Next up, we have Oceiros. I'm sorry, I think he's good, but too many people are talking about him being their favorite boss in Dark Souls 3, and I just can't see how that's possible. I know his lore is great, but the fight itself didn't do a ton for me. It just kind of felt basic for how far in the game he appears, and after you see the bosses that follow, I find it hard to believe that he stands out too much in comparison. And I know you can fight him earlier, but still. Really, he's just much easier than the other bosses around him, which made him feel no different than a slight bump in the road. Overrated. Moving on, we have Champion Gundyr. Now, I have claimed Champion to be overrated for years, but since playing Dark Souls 3 through again, I've changed my decision. Of course, I never thought he was bad, but I was just confused on why everyone hyped up a more difficult reskin of the tutorial boss. But after fighting him more recently, I started to see the appeal. He's just really satisfying. With his quick movesets and long combos, Champion Gundyr feels like a true rematch, even though this is supposedly in a parallel universe. But I love games where you fight an early boss again toward the end to see how far you've come. A lot of people say he's one of the hardest, which I definitely disagree with. I still think he's a tad on the easy side, but I think FromSoft balanced it as best as they could. Properly rated. Next up, we have my personal favorite boss in the main game, the Twin Princes. The flow of this fight is unmatched. Lorien's quick attacks and teleportation is so exhilarating, and the timing of each attack feels almost too perfect. And in my opinion, that's the pinnacle of boss fights. The second phase shook me and had me freaking out a little bit, but smacking Lothric off Lorien's back is a fun extra challenge that adds even more depth to the gameplay. The Twin Princes are not talked about enough and are definitely underrated. Moving on, we have the Ancient Wyvern. I think we are all pretty disappointed by this boss, but luckily we got the dragon fight we were waiting for in the DLC. As for this boss, it's kind of cool in a first time playthrough discovering that you can one-shot it with a plunge attack, but other than that, I don't even really consider it a boss. The only thing you have to do is run past some of the most annoying enemies in the game, do some climbing, and you're done. I give them props for the idea, but I think this fight was a missed opportunity. I think they should have taken away the boss health bar and we wouldn't have had such high expectations. I'd go with overrated, but I don't think anyone cares about this quote-unquote boss, so let's go properly rated. Next up, Nameless King. I think we all broke some controls controllers on this one, the Nameless King is notoriously the hardest boss in this game, and that's a title I'm comfortable giving him. The first phase, he's riding a dragon, so it's a little game of get your head back here. But really, you just have to wait for its fire breathe move to get some easy hits in and hopefully a riposte. The second phase seems easier in theory, but it's definitely not. I don't know what it is about his attacks, but the dodge timing always feels so hard because he is aggressive, but not as much as you think. He'll stop between attacks randomly, so you have to figure out whether he's chilling for a second or if he's about to wind up for one of the highest damage output combos in the game. I think the Nameless King is a great boss lore-wise, fight-wise, and everything in between. He's a nice optional boss if the player wants a challenge in one of the coolest areas in the series. Properly rated. Moving on to the final boss in the main game, we have Soul of Cinder. The amount of movesets and transitions this guy has is unreal, and he's the only boss that could rival the Nameless King in terms of difficulty. This fight is lengthy, and the main problem I have is managing my Estus. The fact that I'll run out of all 15 Estus flasks fighting him is wild and shows how careful you have to be in this fight. Obviously, all the callbacks to Dark Souls 1 are amazing, and I really can't think of a better way to end the series than this boss. I'm actually gonna go underrated here because I don't think this fight is mentioned enough. But that's just the main game. Now let's move on to the DLC. Starting with Sister Friede, wow. To this day, I don't think there's been a more intense fight than this one. 3 whole phases with all kinds of new attacks. FromSoft really outdid themselves with this one. I think this is one of the hardest bosses in the series, and you have to be almost perfect to pull it off. The first phase wasn't too hard, but it prepares you well for what's to come. I will say I'm not a huge fan of the second phase, but it makes sense with the fight and made the reveal for the third phase way better. And the third phase is absolutely incredible. FromSoft did a phenomenal job with the DLC bosses in this game, and Friede gets nothing less than underrated. But maybe I spoke a little too soon, because next we have the champions Gravetender and Gravetender Greatwolf. Definitely the worst boss in the DLC, and really just feels lazy overall. You fight an easy NPC while wolves attack you, then, big surprise, a big wolf comes and runs out of reach for 5 minutes until you can manage to get some hits in. Dogs are already the worst enemy to deal with in these games, so I don't know why they thought a boss fight with one would be fun. Oh, because of Sif. Either way, this fight feels more like a normal enemy encounter than an actual boss fight, but I'm gonna go properly rated because I don't hear anyone hyping this one up. Moving on, we have one of the most slept on bosses in the series, the Demon Princes. It really baffles me how little this fight gets talked about because I think it's a masterpiece and it checks every box. I was a little iffy at first when I saw that it was a gank, but they executed it really well, making one aggressive and the other one super passive. This phase can get overwhelming, but if you lead one of them far enough away, it's really not too much trouble. But then, in classic Ornstein and Smo fashion, the order you kill them in determines who you fight in the second phase, but this time you have to kill both. It took me forever to realize that this was a factor, but one is definitely easier than the other, but it doesn't matter anyway. The second phase is incredible, and I don't think I've ever seen them execute a boss like this so well. Crazy cinematics, super difficult, and a huge step up in quality, showing you what's to come. Underrated. But this is where my praise slows down a bit because next we have Halfight, Spear of the Church. I don't think this boss is horrible, but you can't really expect a fight like this to be great. Obviously, it's completely reliant on who you summon in as the boss, but if you get a good fight, it's pretty solid. For me, I was scared to death of PvP after my wonderful experience of getting invaded and getting my ass handed to me throughout my first playthrough, but I ended up liking the fight. I don't think it's balanced super well, but still, I think it's a cool idea to make you get past a real person before progressing the game. And yeah, you can play offline, but sometimes you gotta man up and face the boss music. Properly rated. Moving on to our last two, we have Darkeater Midir. Midir is a boss I consider to be impossible in my first playthrough, and I only beat him after finishing every other Souls game. And I will admit, he's grown on me a ton since then. One of the best dragon bosses FromSoft has ever done. There is no way to get around this guy and make it easier. Believe me, I tried. And don't say Pestilent Mist, you're almost better off fighting him normally. Midir's attacks do so much damage, and his combos are as intimidating as they are painful. And while I'm personally not a huge fan of the big bosses in these games, it's hard for me to deny that Midir is objectively a great fight. But in my personal opinion, I'm gonna say he's overrated just due to my own preference. And last, but certainly not least, we have Gael. Arguably my favorite boss in the series, Gael is the perfect fight to end the Dark Souls series on with his cinematic movesets and jaw-dropping arena. This is the most fun fight in the game. Each attack feels well designed and calculated while still giving the player plenty of windows to counter. The second phase is like when those guys say, "Bro, my life's a movie." But no, you don't understand. Mine actually just became one. Gael is the reason I wish this game had a boss rush mode, and if the Elden Ring DLC bosses are half as good as him, we're in for a good time. And instead of doing an outro,